The call came in at 0347 hours, and I almost didn't answer it. I was buried deep in a forward operating base in Kandahar, 3 weeks from rotation home, running on 4 hours of sleep and bad coffee when my buddy Derek shoved the satellite phone right in my face. "It's your mother-in-law," he said, his voice careful in a way that made my stomach immediately drop. "Says it's urgent." I took the phone. Carol had never called me overseas. Not once in 14 months. "Kevin." Her voice cracked the moment she heard me breathe. "Kevin, I'm so sorry. I didn't know how to tell you this, and I've been going back and forth for weeks. But you deserve to know before you come home and walk into something you're not at all prepared for." I sat down on my cot. My rifle was leaning against the wall. Outside, someone was running through a weapons check. The completely ordinary sounds of a base going about its business at the absolute edge of the world. "Tell me," I said. "Renee filed paperwork 2 months ago," Carol said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "She changed Emma's last name. She took your name off the birth certificate and replaced it with his. His name is Damon. He's been living in your house since October." I heard every single word. I processed every single word. But my brain refused to line them up into anything that made sense, because this was Renee. Renee, who cried at the airport when I deployed. Renee, who sent me photos every single week of Emma learning to roll over, learning to sit up, cutting her first tooth. Renee, who wrote me letters by hand because she said emails felt impersonal. That same Renee had taken my daughter's name away from her while I was 9,000 miles away, bleeding for my country. "Kevin," Carol said softly. "Are you there?" "I'm here," I said. My voice didn't shake. 14 months in a combat zone teaches you how to stay absolutely level when the entire world falls apart. "I'm coming home in 22 days. "I know. I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," I said. "Just don't warn her." Carol went quiet for a moment. Then very quietly, she said, "Okay." I hung up the phone. Derek was standing in the doorway looking at me with that specific look soldiers get when they know something bad has happened, but they're waiting to be told the exact shape of it. I handed him back the phone and lay down on my cot, staring at the ceiling. 14 months ago, Renee had stood at the departure gate holding 4-month-old Emma against her chest, and she had gripped my arm and said, "Come back to us." Emma had been wearing a tiny headband with a bow on it. Renee had her hair down, which she rarely did, and her eyes were red, but she was holding herself completely together for my sake. "I'll be back before she's walking," I told her. "You better be." I kissed them both. Emma smelled like baby powder and something sweet, and she grabbed my finger with her whole fist the way babies do, like she already understood that holding on mattered. I had served 14 months thinking about that grip. Now I lay on a cot in Kandahar and thought about a man named Damon sleeping in my bed, wearing out my floors, sitting at my kitchen table. And most of all, I thought about my daughter's last name being changed in a courthouse without my knowledge or consent while I was downrange serving a country that was supposed to protect my rights as a father. I didn't cry. I didn't break anything. I just thought with a cold and absolute clarity about what came next. Those 22 days were the longest of my entire life. I didn't tell anyone else on the base what was happening. I went about my duties with the exact same focus I always brought to them. I ran drills. I filed reports. I checked equipment. At night, I made phone calls. My first call was to my brother Patrick, who was an attorney in Charlotte. I laid out what Carol had told me in plain factual terms and listened carefully to everything Patrick said. My second call was to a family law attorney named Howard Stills, who Patrick recommended without a single moment of hesitation. Howard picked up on the second ring. He was the kind of lawyer who doesn't waste any time on false comfort, and I appreciated that more than I could possibly say. "The name change is a serious problem," he told me. "Changing a child's last name without the consent of a legally recognized parent, especially a deployed active duty service member, runs directly into the Service Members Civil Relief Act. She would have needed to serve you proper notice. If she didn't, that process was almost certainly fraudulent. We can challenge it. Can we reverse it? Almost certainly yes. The harder question is what else she's been doing. Has she attempted to modify custody arrangements? I don't know yet. Find out before you land on U.S. soil. I want to know everything she's filed everywhere." I spent the next weeks doing exactly that, quietly and methodically, the same way I'd approach any mission that required precision over speed. Patrick helped me pull court filings. Howard identified a name change petition that had been filed with a fraudulent notice of service because Renee had listed an old APO address that she knew full well was inactive. She'd had more than a year to learn my current mailing address. She had deliberately used a dead one. She had planned this. That was what I kept coming back to in the quiet hours. This wasn't a woman who fell apart from loneliness and made a bunch of bad snap decisions. This was a woman who had calculated every single move, who had apparently decided that the life she wanted with this man was worth more than my daughter's legal identity, who had bet everything on the idea that I would either not find out until it was too late, or that I would be too broken when I did to fight back effectively. She had never met the version of me that came home from 14 months in Kandahar with nothing left to lose. My flight landed in Atlanta on a Tuesday. Patrick picked me up from the airport, and we drove straight to Howard's office where I signed 7 documents before I'd even changed out of my travel clothes. Howard filed an emergency motion with the family court that afternoon, citing the fraudulent service, my status as an active duty service member, and the illegal modification of a birth record without paternal consent. A hearing was set for 10 days out. Then Patrick drove me home. I want to be completely clear about what I was feeling during that drive. I was not hysterical. I was not shaking. I had processed the grief in Kandahar during 22 nights of lying on a cot and staring at the ceiling. And what was left on the other side of that grief was not sadness. It was certainty. I knew exactly what I was walking into. I knew exactly what I was going to say. I had rehearsed nothing, because men who know what they're doing don't need a script. Patrick parked at the curb. I told him to wait. He looked like he wanted to argue, but he'd known me his whole life, and he recognized the look on my face. So he just said, "I'm right here." I walked up the front path of the house I had bought with 4 years of military savings and a VA loan. The house where I had painted the nursery with my own hands before I deployed. The house where I had laid the kitchen tile myself over a long weekend because we couldn't afford a contractor. And I knocked on my own front door. Renee opened it. She looked good. That was the first thing I registered, and it genuinely hit me like a fist, because for 14 months I had carried real guilt about being away from her, about putting her through the stress and loneliness of a deployment with an infant. And standing there looking at her, I could see clearly that she had not been suffering. Her hair was freshly highlighted. She was wearing a sundress I'd never seen before. And on her left hand, catching the afternoon light with casual cruelty, was a ring that I had absolutely not put there. An engagement ring. Her face went through 4 expressions in about 2 seconds. Surprise. Then panic. Then a flash of something calculating. And then she settled on a version of warmth that didn't come close to reaching her eyes. "Kevin," she said, like she was greeting a neighbor. "I didn't know you were landing today." "I know you didn't. You should have called. Emma's actually napping right now." "Where is he?" It wasn't a question. Renee's chin lifted slightly. And there it was. There was the real version of her, the one she'd been hiding behind those handwritten letters and weekly photos while she rebuilt her entire life around another man, using my house, my daughter, and my last name as the scaffolding. "Kevin, I think we should talk calmly." "Renee." I kept my voice even, not because I was calm, but because I had learned in 14 months of combat that the men who stay level are the ones who maintain control of every single situation. Yelling is for people who are afraid they won't be heard. I had no such fear. "I'm going to ask you one more time. Where is he?" A sound from behind her. Footsteps on the hardwood I had laid myself. And then he appeared in the hallway. A broad-shouldered man in a gray t-shirt who stopped when he saw me and immediately understood, with the particular discomfort of a man who has been living a lie he thought was completely safe, that the reckoning he had convinced himself would never come had finally arrived. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked back at Renee. "My daughter's last name," I said. Renee opened her mouth. She started something about how she had needed to make decisions, how I wasn't there, how life didn't stop just because I was deployed. And I let her talk for about 12 seconds before I held up my hand. "Stop." She stopped. "I have the court filing, Renee. I have the fraudulent service notice. I have everything. You listed a dead APO address to prevent me from being notified, which means you committed straight-up fraud in a family court proceeding. My attorney filed an emergency motion this morning." The color drained completely from her face. "You want to talk about how life doesn't stop?" I said. "You're right. It doesn't. So let's talk about how Emma's name goes back to what it was. Let's talk about how my name goes back on that birth certificate. And then let's talk about this ring on your hand, Because whatever you thought was going to happen here, I need you to understand something very clearly. I looked directly at her. I'm not going to fall apart. I'm not going to beg. And I am not going to let you take my daughter. Damon stepped forward at that point. I don't know what he intended. Maybe he thought physical presence would be enough. That positioning himself next to Renee would communicate something about ownership or protection. He said, I think you should lower your voice. I turned to look at him fully for the very first time. You, I said, have absolutely nothing to say to me. You moved into my house, slept in my bed, put a ring on my wife's finger, and allowed her to erase my daughter's name while I was overseas. You don't get to tell me a single thing about my voice. He said nothing else. I looked at Renee one final time. She was gripping the door frame. The engagement ring caught the light again. I'll see Emma when she wakes up, I said. You should call your attorney. Then I walked back to Patrick's car, got in, and exhaled for the first time in 22 days. Patrick looked at me. You okay? No, I said honestly. But I will be. We drove to his place where I slept for 11 hours straight. The next morning, I started the real work. Howard was methodical and brilliant in the way that the genuinely best lawyers are, and what he laid out for me over the following days was both worse than I'd expected and exactly as actionable as he'd promised. Renee had filed the name change petition using that deliberately incorrect address to avoid serving me properly. She had also filed, months later, a petition to modify parental rights, which she had similarly attempted to serve to the same dead address. If that modification had gone through unchallenged, she could have severely limited my parental access on the grounds of absence, using my deployment itself as evidence of abandonment. She had tried to legally erase me as a father while I was serving overseas. Howard said it with the flat effect of a man reporting a weather forecast. I sat across from his desk and felt something move through me that I didn't have a precise word for. It wasn't rage exactly, though rage was absolutely part of it. It was more like clarification, like everything blurry becoming sharply, permanently clear. The SCRA violation alone gives us significant leverage, Howard said. Courts do not look kindly on this. Add the fraudulent service and the attempted custody modification, and we have a strong case for sanctions, reversal of the name change, and a custody arrangement that reflects your actual status as a present, invested parent. What do I need to do? Document everything. Keep all communication in writing from this point forward. Do not engage emotionally with her or her partner in any forum that could be used against you. Let me handle the legal machinery. I was very good at following orders from people I trusted. Patrick had already pulled Renee's financial records connected to our joint accounts, which she hadn't yet moved to close me out of, perhaps because she hadn't expected me home quite so soon. What he found there was genuinely illuminating. Over the past 14 months, she had redirected a significant portion of our joint savings, including the account that received my military pay allotment, which I had set up in complete good faith to take care of my family while I was gone. She had spent a substantial chunk of it on the apartment she'd briefly rented before moving Damon into the house, on furniture he'd apparently wanted, on her own wardrobe upgrade, and on what appeared to be a trip to Savannah that she'd taken with him while Emma stayed with Carol. I did not confront Renee about any of this directly. I documented it. I forwarded everything to Howard. I opened a separate personal account, redirected my remaining pay, and filed the paperwork to remove Renee's access to the military benefits portal. Then I called her firm. That requires some explanation. Renee worked as a paralegal at a firm downtown that handled, among other things, government contracts. The managing partner was a former JAG officer who Howard happened to know professionally. Howard didn't make any inappropriate calls. He simply mentioned in a professionally appropriate context that a matter involving fraudulent court filings in a military family case had come across his desk and that one of the named parties was employed at that firm. The managing partner was thorough and discreet. Renee was placed on administrative leave while the firm conducted its own review. Because a paralegal who commits fraud in court filings, even personal ones, is a straight-up liability that no firm with government contract relationships can afford. She didn't know I was behind it. She thought it was a coincidence, which was fine. Carol called me a few days after I got back. She was crying, but they were the relieved kind of tears. She told me that she had never approved of what Renee had done, that she had tried to talk her daughter out of it for months, that she was willing to testify to the timeline if Howard needed a witness. I thanked her genuinely. She was losing a version of her daughter too, the one she'd thought she had raised. And I didn't take that lightly. My friends from my unit, Derek and two others who'd rotated back stateside before me, showed up at Patrick's apartment one evening with food and absolutely zero pity on their faces, which was exactly what I needed. They sat around Patrick's kitchen table and listened to the full situation. And when I was done talking, Derek said, "What do you need from us?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "That's terrible." Just, "What do you need?" I told them I needed character witnesses who could speak to my relationship with Emma before deployment. They all said yes without a single moment of hesitation. Meanwhile, things were unraveling for Renee in ways I was peripherally aware of but not actively engineering, because I genuinely didn't need to. When you commit fraud, the consequences have a way of propagating completely on their own. Her coworkers at the firm became aware of her leave status and the reason behind it. Mutual friends from our social circle, people who had genuinely liked me and who had been kept completely in the dark about the full scope of what Renee had done, began hearing the actual story. I didn't go out of my way to broadcast it, but I didn't hide from it either when people asked, and I answered direct questions directly. Damon, for his part, had apparently told Renee that she had the whole situation under control. The engagement ring had suggested he'd been confident enough in their future to make a formal commitment. But confidence built entirely on someone else's fraud is a genuinely fragile thing. As the legal proceedings began to take real shape and the financial exposure became clearer, his confidence appeared to seriously waver. This was information that came to me through Carol, who remained in contact with her daughter and relayed what seemed relevant. I wasn't monitoring Damon's emotional state for personal satisfaction. I just needed to know if his wavering would affect Renee's litigation decisions. It did. Within 2 weeks of the emergency motion being heard, Renee's attorney reached out to Howard with a conciliation proposal. Howard brought it to me. It was not serious. It offered me reasonable visitation with my own daughter and acknowledged the name change as a good faith error, which was the legal equivalent of calling a house fire a lighting incident. I read it once, set it down, and told Howard to decline. We want full reversal of the name change, shared legal custody, and discovery on all financial accounts going back 18 months, I said. Howard looked at me with something that might have been genuine professional admiration. That's exactly what we're going to ask for, he said. The hearing was the kind of day that sharpens everything around it so completely that you can remember decades later exactly how the air felt. Howard was precise and methodical. He laid out the SCRA violation, the fraudulent service, the timeline of financial diversion, and the attempted custody modification with the kind of organized clarity that left absolutely no interpretive wiggle room. Renee's attorney tried to argue good faith on the address issue. The judge, a retired veteran herself, was simply not interested in that argument. She asked Renee's attorney directly whether his client had access to her husband's current contact information at any point during the filing period. The attorney attempted a non-answer. The judge moved on. The name change was reversed. Emma's birth certificate would be corrected to reflect her original surname. The custody petition was dismissed with a notation about the improper service. A formal custody arrangement was to be negotiated, with the court signaling clearly that my deployment could absolutely not be used as evidence of parental disengagement. Outside the courtroom, Renee was talking to her attorney in a low, urgent voice. She looked up and saw me walking toward the exit with Howard and Patrick. For a moment, our eyes met. She looked like she wanted to say something. I looked at her the way you look at a problem you've already completely solved. And I kept walking. Damon was not there. He had not been there for any of the hearings. I would find out later, through Carol, that the engagement had been quietly called off sometime during the 3rd week of proceedings. Whether he had decided that a fraud case and a financial dispute were too much complication for a new relationship, or whether Renee had made the decision herself for strategic reasons, I genuinely didn't know. And I didn't spend much time wondering. It wasn't relevant to my life at all. Emma recognized me. That was the thing I had been most afraid of in my most honest private moments during those 22 days in Kandahar. She had been 4 months old when I left, 18 months old when I came home. I had missed more than half of her entire life to that point, and I had been terrified, in a way I couldn't say out loud to anyone, that she would look at me like a complete stranger. She didn't. The first time I held her after I came home, at a neutral exchange arranged by the attorneys, she looked at my face very seriously for about 4 seconds with those enormous dark eyes she'd had since she was born. And then she reached up and grabbed my nose with her whole fist, the exact same way she'd grabbed my finger at the airport 18 months ago. And she made a sound that was not quite a word yet, but was clearly intended as direct communication. I sat down on the floor of that visitation space with my daughter, and I held her, and I breathed. I did not cry because there were attorneys present and I had a reputation to maintain. But it was a genuinely very near thing. That grip. She still had that grip. The months that followed were about construction. I'm a whole lot better at building things than I am at tearing them down, which is part of why the legal side of what had happened had felt genuinely uncomfortable even as I knew every bit of it was necessary. What felt completely natural to me was structure and forward progress. So I focused on those things. I moved into an apartment 20 minutes from the house, in a neighborhood I had scouted carefully for school districts in proximity to Patrick. I furnished it practically, with the kind of deliberate plainness that leaves real room for a child's things. I set up Emma's room first before my own bedroom, which seemed completely obvious to me, but which Patrick noted with an expression that suggested it meant something significant to him. I went back to the base for the tail end of my service commitment, and I structured the custody arrangement around it with Howard's help. Patrick stepped in as a local contact for Emma's exchanges when I was on base. The arrangement worked because I was methodical about every single part of it, and because the family court appreciated a parent who showed up to every hearing, filed every document on time, and communicated everything in writing. I also started running again, not in the punishing, no alternative way of a deployment, but deliberately, with routes I chose because they were genuinely good routes through neighborhoods I was learning to consider mine. I ran early in the mornings when the city was quiet, and I could actually think without interruption. Howard had warned me to be careful about social media and public statements throughout the proceedings, so I had been. But once the legal matters were fully resolved, I didn't make any grand announcements either. The people who needed to know what had happened already knew. Everyone else could think whatever they liked. My mother flew in from Ohio and spent most of that time in Emma's room making things that Emma didn't yet have words to fully appreciate, but that I photographed exhaustively because someday she absolutely would. My father, who was a man of very few words and absolute conviction, called me on a Thursday evening and said, "You did right," and then talked about the weather for 3 minutes and hung up. That was the most genuinely emotional conversation we'd had in 15 years, and I valued it accordingly. Derek came back from his second deployment, and we met up for dinner at a place near the base. He asked about Emma. I showed him approximately 47 photos on my phone, which he looked through without a single ounce of impatience. He said she had my ears, which was both completely true and a real compliment coming from him. "You doing all right?" he asked, which from Derek was a serious inquiry. "Yeah," I said. "I really am." He nodded like he actually believed me, which he did, because Derek has never once in his life accepted an answer he didn't believe. I went to a couple of sessions with a counselor the VA recommended, which I mention not because it was dramatic, but because it was genuinely useful, and useful things are worth acknowledging. She was a direct woman who didn't waste sessions on blame distribution and instead focused on the practical question of how to build the life I wanted from the materials currently available. That was a framework I completely understood. We covered seriously useful ground. Emma started saying something that was recognizably around month 4 of the new custody arrangement. It was not her first word, which had been something that sounded like "b" and appeared to refer to her bottle, but it was the first word that was clearly directed at a specific person. I was sitting on the floor of her room at my apartment when she said it, looking directly at me, and I responded with a steadiness that I was genuinely proud of in that moment and for a very long time afterward. "That's right," I told her. "I'm right here." I finished my service commitment and transitioned to a project management role at a defense contractor in Charlotte, which Patrick had flagged for me 6 months before my discharge date, because he is exactly the kind of brother who scouts opportunities while you're still out in the field. The work was structured and technical and required the same kind of precise, consequence-aware planning I'd spent years developing, which meant I was good at it faster than most people expected. I also started coaching a youth soccer league on Saturday mornings, which had begun as something a colleague mentioned and which I had gone to once out of pure obligation and then kept going back to because it turned out I was genuinely good at it. And because the 8-year-olds were extremely honest about absolutely everything, which I found deeply clarifying. Emma came to my games. She sat in a camping chair with a snack container and watched with the focused attention of a small person who has decided that something is genuinely interesting. She cheered at moments that did not always correspond to the moments the parents of the actual players cheered, which was consistently excellent. Renee and I communicated by text and occasional brief phone calls about Emma's schedule and medical appointments and developmental milestones. We were not friends. We were not enemies. We were two people with a shared responsibility and a very clear legal framework, which suited me perfectly fine. She had taken the ring off, which I noticed the way you notice things you're not particularly invested in, and she was working at a different firm now in a smaller capacity. I had not engineered that outcome, and I took absolutely no satisfaction in reporting it. It was simply what had happened. One afternoon in the spring, I was picking Emma up from Renee's house. Emma came running down the front path with her shoes on the wrong feet, carrying a stuffed rabbit by one ear, moving with the particular committed velocity of a toddler who has fully decided she is going somewhere. Renee was in the doorway watching. I crouched down and Emma crashed into me at full speed the way she always did, and I caught her and straightened up with her on my hip. And she immediately grabbed my nose. I looked up and found Renee watching us. Her expression was something I recognized only because I had spent a long time learning to read things accurately rather than optimistically. It was regret, not the performing kind. The real, private, quiet kind that doesn't ask for anything back. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said far more clearly in courtrooms and legal documents, and the 14 months of steady, completely visible presence I'd built since coming home. I buckled Emma into her car seat and drove to the park where she fed ducks with a focus and generosity that I found genuinely inspiring. I sat on a bench in the April sun and watched my daughter and felt something that I would describe, if pressed, as peace. Not the peace of having gotten everything I wanted. I hadn't. I'd lost a year and a half with my daughter and a marriage I genuinely believed in and a version of my future I'd planned for and worked toward and come home to find already completely gone. But the peace of knowing exactly who I was. Of having been tested in the most personal way a man can possibly be tested. Of having had every single assumption about my life stripped away in a phone call at 0347 in Kandahar. And of having responded to that not by collapsing, not by losing myself in bitterness, but by getting up every single morning and doing the next right thing. Emma looked over her shoulder from the duck pond and found me with her eyes immediately, the way she always did, with that instinctive accuracy that children have about the people who belong to them. She raised one hand in a wave that was really more of a full arm swing. I waved back. About a year after the hearing, I ran into someone at a work function. Her name was Claire, and she was a structural engineer who had done 2 years with the Army Corps of Engineers before moving to the private sector. She shook my hand with the directness of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove and asked me a question about a bridge project I'd referenced in a presentation with what was clearly genuine professional curiosity rather than just making small talk. We had coffee the following week. We talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with our respective personal histories. And then we talked about those too, carefully and honestly, because neither of us was even slightly interested in building anything on a foundation of omission. She met Emma about 4 months in. Emma studied her for a long moment with those serious dark eyes and then offered her the stuffed rabbit, which was the absolute highest form of social acceptance available in Emma's current relationship framework. Claire accepted it with appropriate gravity. I don't know exactly what the future looks like from here, which is a sentence that would have genuinely frightened the version of me who thought he had everything planned out and who married a woman at 26 on the assumption that life rewards careful investment. But the version of me sitting on that park bench watching Emma negotiate with ducks had made real peace with uncertainty in a way that felt less like resignation and a whole lot more like trust. Trust that I knew who I was. Trust that I had the tools to handle whatever came next. Trust that Emma, who had my ears and her grandmother's stubbornness and the grip of someone who knows exactly what she's holding on to, was going to be more than fine. I heard about Damon eventually, in the way you hear about things that no longer concern you directly. Carol mentioned in passing that he'd moved out of state. Whether the engagement ending had been the reason or the result of other things, I genuinely didn't know. He existed at the absolute edge of my awareness, which is exactly the amount of real estate he had earned. Renee, I understood from Carol, was in therapy, and had said things during that process that Carol relayed to me, not as accusations or apologies, but simply as information. That she had been genuinely afraid during the deployment. Afraid and alone, and had let that fear drive her towards someone who felt certain when everything else felt completely uncertain, and had then made decision after decision to protect that choice rather than facing the original fear. She had not asked for my forgiveness through Carol. Carol had not offered it on her behalf. I think we all understood that forgiveness was not the relevant currency here. What was relevant was Emma. Emma, who was now 2.5 and had strong opinions about absolutely everything, including which socks were acceptable, whether the duck pond was preferable to the playground, and whether the stuffed rabbit should be addressed by his proper name during bedtime, which, for the record, was Gerald. Emma, who called me Dada with the casual confidence of a child who has never once had any reason to doubt that word. Emma, who I would be at every soccer game and school play and doctor's appointment and bad night and good morning for the rest of her life. Not because a court had ordered me to, but because she was mine in the truest way that word means anything. And I was hers. And that was simply, completely, the truth of the matter. I had come home from Kandahar to find my life had been straight up dismantled by a woman I'd trusted completely. I had rebuilt it with better materials. That was the whole story, and it was more than enough.